Good evening to all members of ICOMOS India National Scientific Committee on Risk Preparedness. Thank you for joining us on this third Saturday of this month. I am Priyanka Panjwani, the coordinator of National Scientific Committee on Risk Preparedness, and along with my co-coordinator Shehzad, I am happy to welcome you to the fourth Culturist Tech Talk and monthly meeting, the last one of this year. Culturist Tech Talks is a member-driven initiative for knowledge sharing and engagement which began in September 2021 this year. It aligns with the ICOMOS India strategic plan and MOA, and we hope to take this ahead with our 32 members in the next year as well on the second Saturday of every month. So before we begin our talk, I would just like to remind you of a few ground rules as shown on this slide. Thank you. Today, I am delighted to invite my colleague and fellow member Ipshita Karmakar to present the Culturist Tech Talk with us at NSC Risk Preparedness. Ipshita graduated as an architect from Kamla Raheja Vidyanidhi Institute for Architecture and Environmental Studies and has subsequently worked at an intersection of urban design, architecture and planning since 2017. Currently, she is a Fulbright Fellow and JN Tata Scholar pursuing her Masters of City Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology 2023. Ipshita's work experience includes projects such as post-earthquake reconstruction of Kathmandu Darbar Square in Nepal, as well as a year-long research on Nepal's architecture and urban planning. She has served as a curator and project coordinator for a virtual exhibition on water security and public health in Mumbai during the COVID-19 pandemic. Her ongoing work at MIT focuses on mapping coastal resilience along the Massachusetts northern coastline and tabulating economic loss and vulnerability. Today, she will share with us her work, and I'm really looking forward to her exciting talk. Over to you, Ipshita. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Priyanka, for the great introduction, and thank you everyone for giving me the opportunity to share a little bit about my work. I'm going to share my screen now. And I'd really like to, I'm sharing a bit about my work from 2018 onwards to now, the kind of work that I'm doing at MIT. A lot of it has been related to risk and resilience in South Asia and now in the USA and hopefully further on. I really want to thank all the collaborators and organizations that I've worked with. A lot of it is their work where I have only supported them in various capacities. So I would like to acknowledge that. My first gist with risk and resilience actually started with the post-earthquake reconstruction work of the Kathmandu Darbar Square after the Gorkha earthquake of 2015. So 7.8 Richter scale earthquake hit Nepal, and it led to a devastating loss of heritage buildings, of private buildings, of institutional buildings across. And in 2018, I joined the Himalayan Consulting Architects and Engineers with architects Kai Weise and Annie Joshi to work on the reconstruction of the Kathmandu Darbar Square. So Kathmandu Darbar Square is one of the three monarchic palaces of Kathmandu. So there's Patan, there's Bhaktapur, and there's Kathmandu, the Hanuman Dhoka Darbar Square. Where I was working with is essentially the residential quarters, which if you can see my cursor is here. I was also working on the reconstruction of the Kasta Mandap, which is a 5th century temple that is in the same complex. And I was working in a few other buildings here, like the Treasury building and doing a little bit of mapping work here and there. Most of the work that we did with the residential buildings of the Hanuman Dhoka Darbar Square, which is basically the palace square. It is currently now not in use, but at that time they were trying to convert it into a museum building. And a lot of the damage that we saw at that point was not reconstructed. We were trying to think of also a demolition plan. So of buildings that we thought would not survive reconstruction, to think of isolating which parts can be reconstructed and which can be just renovated. And a lot of it involved damage mapping. So trying to figure out where exactly the impact of the earthquake was felt, how we can manage to measure that, and just kind of identify what are the reasons that this kind of damage has taken place. So we believed in the integrity of the structure. We believe that the structure itself was built for resilience, but where we saw the damage was usually in parts where renovation had taken place. So where lime mortar, for instance, was used instead of mud mortar, where another structure was added to a structure which was seismically safe on its own, but in addition, so those were the points that became weaker. And we kind of started mapping those and creating plans for strengthening or either demolishing them. One of the most interesting projects that I did was the Kasta Mandap. So the Kasta Mandap is a 5th century temple and it completely collapsed in the 2015 earthquake. And what happened is that it's a very important cultural and political site in Kathmandu. And for 3 years, this site was actually caught in a tussle where many international organizations wanted to come in and build it in a certain way. But the sansthans that were actually looking after this place, which is sansthans in Kathmandu, actually take care of community property and heritage property, and they are mostly volunteer organizations. They wanted to rebuild it in their ways with more traditional methods. So keeping in, involving local artisans, involving people from the Newar community. And this is sometime in 2021 when the Kasta Mandap Reconstruction Committee took over. And I was working with the Kasta Mandap Reconstruction Committee and Kai and Annie in this project. This is the final visualization of how we imagined Kasta Mandap to be. So Kasta Mandap is entirely a wooden structure. It is built in a way, I mean, the myth around is that it's built with one tree, basically, and all of the joineries were done without nails. Again, the kind of damage that we saw where it actually collapsed was where renovation had happened, like different materials were used, like things like water damage had happened at the bottom of the columns because of ritual washing of the floor, since it's a temple, and all of that neglect in the maintenance actually had led to the loss of structural integrity. A lot of the process, because this was done entirely with a community organization, was that while we were even working with it, and a lot of it was happening with different stakeholders like experts. There were people from universities coming in because it is a very important site in Kathmandu and a 5th century temple. But even so, there were a lot of community members in Kathmandu who were involved in the day-to-day construction of it. So even things like, say, hoisting the column was done not with cranes or anything else. And also the site did not allow cranes to actually enter. But it was done actually with all of these people that you see in the images, pulling the columns manually. And it is very interesting because it turned almost like a spectacle, like a festival, and the living goddess also came to bless the entire process. A lot of the reconstruction process in Kasta Mandap was also very experimental and research and development based, because not a lot of information was available. The kind of photographs that we also had was of recent renovation. So we actually had to figure out how it would have been originally. It was one of our concerns. We were trying to basically understand whether we should reconstruct it to the point where it was when it was actually built, or do we build up to the various iterations of it that happened across the years. So a lot of it involved also like carbon dating to figure out what was the first part of the temple, for instance, that was built, because it was built incrementally. It involved trying to find the right soil sample from Kathmandu, so which could be used in the mud mortar. And it was important for the community to get it from across Kathmandu and its surrounding regions. And then to also look at things like photogrammetry, to also have this very investigative scientific process of trying to match all the salvage pieces that we got after the collapse, like things like columns and brackets. It was important that all of them were matched in the correct ways, and a lot of it had to be done by looking at photographs and just even basically relying on the expertise of artisans who have been working on this for a very long time, generations of artisans. Post that, I was working there for a year, but then post that I came back to India, and that is when I joined iCommerce India, and I joined the Risk Preparedness Committee. And at this point was on 20th May 2020, actually was when, sorry, the date is wrong, was when Cyclone Amphan hit the Sundarbans, hit West Bengal and parts of Orissa. And it was at that point when a group of people from from ICOMOS Risk Preparedness came together to create a situation analysis post-disaster. Aparna ma'am and Shahzad was a part of the project. And basically the idea was to look at who are the stakeholders who are, because it's a very emerging situation, it was very time sensitive. So it was important to work with different stakeholders who are already on the field. Many of us were not even on the field, but to identify who they are, who can help distribute aid, who is reaching which part of the community, to identify what are the pre-event significant values that we can identify from the site, and what are the post-event threats that we can predict might happen after the disaster, and then thinking of recommendations to that. And then I think this document was distributed to several of these organizations that we see in the stakeholder and actions table. Immediately after that, there was also the threat of cyclone Nisarg on the west coast. So I was in Mumbai at that point, and a group of us from Mumbai decided to come together to do a pre-disaster analysis this time. So it was also Aparna ma'am, it was Siddhant Shah, who's part of a different NSC, I think. But we worked on, again, trying to figure out what are the threats that we predict, and then what are the recommendations for safeguarding historic buildings, museums, and art galleries, and what can be done at that point. And this became more like and this was actually then distributed to various museums and art galleries in Mumbai at that point. Even though Nisarg did not actually have the impact that we thought it would have, but this again became a very time-sensitive exercise where we actually did that in a day with members of NSCRP. In 2020, again, a disaster hit, which was the COVID-19 pandemic. And after that, I, along with the Living Waters Museum, which I think is closely related to the working group on water heritage, we decided to look at water and public health in Mumbai. And to do that, we kind of brought together about 40 water activists, professionals, researchers, heritage professionals to come together and look at what are the impacts of public health and water in Mumbai, and how is it that we have come to this point? Like, are there any repercussions of that? So Confluence actually became a year-long virtual exhibition. It involved a lot of existing work of people that on Mumbai's water that had already been done. A lot of it was about storytelling and narration. And it involved also a week-long speaker event of inviting people to talk about various threats of water with respect to the pandemic. One of the galleries that I will talk about here is water and public health. Again, the question was, what has been the history of water-related epidemics in Mumbai, and how that relates to the COVID-19 pandemic now, and can any of the responses be used to think about how our response to the COVID-19 pandemic was at that point? The interesting fact is, and something that even I didn't know, was that about 80% of Mumbai's diseases were related to waterborne diseases. And Mumbai had a very long and interesting history and a timeline, actually, of waterborne epidemics. So that even included how the Bombay plague started, for instance, and the kind of draconian measures that were taken after that, how the Spanish flu was controlled. Again, there was this is an exhibit in the exhibition which talks about how malaria became a threat in Mumbai. And then because of that, several of these domestic and public wells were closed down, which are basically shared sources of water. And then the reliance on piped water increased. And when that increased, eventually, there were people who were excluded from having an equal access to water. And that led to another host of diseases and epidemics. And that led to another layer to the pandemic, which was the fact that water scarce areas and containment zones, COVID-19 hotspots started. We did an exercise, a GIS-based exercise. Abhijit Ekbote, who is one of the artists who did that, did an exercise of overlapping both of them to see if there's a correlation between water scarce areas in Mumbai and COVID-19 hotspots. And there was a clear correlation. So most of them were informal settlements, dense settlements where people did not have enough water, and were also COVID-19 hotspots. And it also kind of brought into it also brought into focus, I think, this whole narrative that had been created around the COVID-19 pandemic of hand washing and sanitation and exclusion, and to kind of expect that from people who are already living in with either no water or very little water. So then those are some of the questions that came up with the exhibition. Finally, the work at MIT that we started, and Juanita is here, who's also worked with us. This is a class project. This we did for GIS. And one of the things that we were looking at was how we can measure flood risk zones in northern Massachusetts coastline and to think of economic vulnerability. So can we tabulate economic vulnerability for those zones? And one of the things that we did in terms of understanding flood risk zones, which is different from, say, FEMA, is that we tried to identify what is the extent of a storm surge. We realized that storm surges are more immediate threats than, say, rising sea levels. And then to tabulate that, we realized that it's about 15.76 feet is the extent of a Sandy equivalent. So there was a storm surge called Sandy some years ago, which we used as a reference. And we said that that is the extent by to which the coastline is going to be affected. And we try to map residential parcels within that. So we looked at tax parcels in those areas, and we try to identify what are the most vulnerable areas. So where is the most spatial aggregation of these tax parcels? And then with that, are there any socioeconomic vulnerabilities with it? So we looked at race and ethnicity. We looked at owners versus renters. We said that owners are going to have more damage than, say, renters who could afford to move out. But accumulative of that damage is still significant. And we, as next steps, we were also thinking of looking at tenure and mortgage status and thinking about how that is going to affect economic vulnerability in these areas. So an exercise that we did is that we saw these blue lines are actually FEMA flood risk maps that are already created by FEMA. And what FEMA does is that whichever tax parcels falls in these lines, they direct those communities to get the National Flood Insurance Policy. And it is only on the basis of that policy that they will provide aid in the aftermath of a disaster. And we realized with our own analysis that there were several tax parcels that were falling outside of those lines. So that becomes a concern because that also dictates now which communities are going to get aid in priority. And in a very time-sensitive exercise, as we saw, even with Nisarg and Amphan, these are studies that we should do prior to a disaster to kind of understand which are the vulnerable communities. And especially if we can identify socioeconomic vulnerability, then we can direct aid in a more prioritized manner to those who need it first. And this was, at the end of the day, we identified a few communities, a few cities in the northern Massachusetts coastline, which we thought had the highest loss in terms of economics. And to go ahead, we were also thinking of looking at livelihood loss, and again, to bring it back to this discussion of heritage and cultural heritage, and look at all these different layers that can come with flood risks. So yeah, this is where I have worked in risk and resilience across the years. Hopefully, I'm also hoping to continue the research in Nepal to think about how civil society organizations, such as the Guthi Sanstans, for instance, how did they manage to work against international organizations in the reconstruction process, and how did they manage to have an equal say in risk and resilience and post-disaster management, and how they have continued to have a very important role to play in disaster management in a kind of a recurring earthquake that we see in the Nepal area. So I would love to have your questions and comments.
Great, superb. Thank you so much, Ipshita. Disaster doesn't seem to stop to hit us. Huh? I mean, it keeps going on and on. I mean, from Kathmandu images to Massachusetts. I think you gave us a good overview. I mean, I've seen Kathmandu, we have all seen images from Rohit and from Vanika, but doesn't fail to amaze us how engagement with cultural heritage and the community has been done so successfully there. And yeah, I've also seen your Confluence exhibition, and I was enthralled by it, by how people were brought together, the experts as well as, I mean, children as well. So I'm really happy to see your work and looking forward. Yeah, I have one question. We can start off the question answers. regarding the Massachusetts project, did you use any existing framework for mapping the vulnerability, economic vulnerability?
And Juanita, you are also like, please feel free to answer the question also. We looked at several research papers and we looked at hazard mitigation plans of each city. So each city has their own and they have their own frameworks of mapping vulnerability. But of course, they have several. Given the duration, like this was a 3-week project, we couldn't look at everything that we wanted to, but race, ethnicity, income, mortgage tenure, and then several other criteria become a comprehensive index by which they map these socioeconomic vulnerabilities. What we did was actually a very simplified way of doing that.
Okay, so you combined it for your benefit.
Yeah,
I mean,
and this is
also,
also,
yeah, go on.
sorry. No, so this is also information that is freely available on the American Community Survey website. So this is, they also have data like rent as 30% of your income. And these are good metrics then to find out what socioeconomic vulnerabilities, at least in terms of income. I
Yes.
know that there are some caveats in coming to race, historical, other such metrics.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so fascinating because, I mean, talking about insurance and economics of vulnerability, I recently read that the whole climate prediction movement started because of losses in insurance. The East India Company had huge losses in the Sundarban area, and that's how they started to predict climate, you know. Anyway.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay. So because of losses, they started predicting.
Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
Any other questions? If anyone has, please feel free to unmute yourself.
So, Apna, can you like just ask the question? You want to
Yeah,
yeah, please.
yeah. So, Ipshita, I was just wondering, like, what else in the water, in the Mumbai water and COVID work
Yeah.
that you've done? What else, like, I know we're not in a post-COVID stage, or we can't say that we've passed that, but it was a very interesting study that showed how, I mean, I've been thinking about this, and this is math, which is a very good thing, even if it's just for Mumbai, but it makes sense that, like you said, you keep on telling people to sanitize your hands, etc. But if there's water scarcity, what would you do? I was wondering, like, now that you have GIS in your kitty, what, I know we don't have that kind of data available, but if you were to get ground data, or let's stay in that situation, what other layer would you add in that study?
So off the top of my head, we also had discussions with Abhijit for this. Abhijit is the GIS expert.
Okay.
We actually wanted to also have a layer on healthcare facilities. So we thought that is also another one of those metrics. So you may have COVID-19 hotspots and water scarce areas, which were the two layers that were there. But it's also important to know again what is the resilience that is already built in. So we were thinking, if we know about healthcare facilities, or if we know of community centers or informal healthcare facilities within these communities, we'll be able to also understand what is the level of resilience. Because if you remember, then like the cases in Dharavi shot up, but they also reduced equally fast.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think is a very interesting thing to look at. So what worked in their healthcare systems and their community systems that they were able to tap into.
That's
So
it.
that
That's it. Yeah.
So, just to add in, like public spaces, availability of public spaces and accessibility of public spaces can be an additional layer to this map. Why? Because COVID-19, like all, the rule was to quarantine, but rooms, like the spaces which we have, the areas which the slum colonies have, does not allow you, like they are very much crammed in slum-like conditions. So public spaces, if they have the availability of public spaces, it can just, for children, it can be a playground. For elders, it can be a meeting ground, because everybody was grounded at that COVID time. So these, if adding a layer of public spaces within these settlements can bring out another dimension of COVID and quarantine and public space.
Yes, that because I think that was one of the big criticisms that came through, that all these lockdowns for these people who are living in very cramped quarters, being out was more safe than being in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is interesting the scale on which the Mumbai thing was. You've covered the greater Mumbai almost, and yet you will like to believe that it's this. If you put in your scale to it, it'll be like, oh, just imagine what happens on the ground level to understand that kind of risk because of a resource unavailability. And then when you add, like Shahzad was just saying about the resource unavailability of even something like a public open space.
Yeah.
Water, obviously, it's one of the basic needs, but I find it very interesting. It's very nice. I think RP should take this forward and put in a
Yes.
lot of different layers. I'm sure a lot of people would want to add a lot of different
Yeah,
layers to it.
it'll give us a very different look of India, in
Yeah,
terms of vulnerabilities and capacities.
exactly. Because like health has now become one major risk for the entire world. And then
Yeah.
if you look at resources, we are never going to fall short, but we still are short of resources.
No, I still remember one person gave a talk at ECROM from my program. It was like about what heritage can do. And they were like this library in Boston, which is the National Library in Boston, and the Boston Library. And then that how they are, offering toilets to people.
Yes, yes, there was a nice video about it, how they're opening up their doors to allow the homeless or the people who are in public services to utilize these services of public spaces.
Yeah.
Nice.
It would also have been interesting to also map these, as you're saying, like sanitation facilities. So what are the community sanitation facilities? What are the community water points in those areas? Both formal and informal.
Yeah, we
Um,
do have a scheme in India, right, about Sulabh Shauchalays for all.
Modi ji's toilets. Please, let's not
Yes.
forget Modi ji. Huh?
Yes. Oh,
Yeah,
yes.
that also
Yes.
brings down to another perspective of commons, as like water as commons, public spaces as commons, shared
Mm.
facilities, and like all these slum areas have more of a public facilities rather than a private, like public toilets also. The houses, they don't have their own private toilets, but they use the community build managed by the
Yeah.
urban management bodies. So it's also about the question of do India, like progressing ahead, facing more COVID-like situations, do we focus on the commons as shared resources, or build more of a private things? But just one another question, Ikshita. So you worked for like for the Kathmandu Darbar, you work with the community body, and then for the ICOMOS projects like Amphan and all that, you
Mhm.
work with the associate, you work with voluntary, you work within the voluntary organization. So in terms of time perspectives, in terms of doing things, where do you feel is the priority was focused, like those community organizations in Nepal, they are more proactive, or there should be like these voluntary organizations like we clubbed with ICOMOS, with ICROM, and some others? So how do you point out to that?
So in Kathmandu, and especially for the Kastamandap Reconstruction Committee, but also for Hanuman Doka, what happened was that even though there are community organizations who was spearheading the effort, they had to work in conjunction with the Department of Archaeology, which is the government of Nepal. So in both cases, there was a certain amount of bureaucracy that influenced the process. So even in Nepal, while there was strength in numbers and while there was this urgency in kind of working, a lot of the process was getting stuck in this whole bureaucratic process of getting approvals from the government of Nepal. So, and I think we ran into our own troubles here with e-commerce as well. So I think that is the thing, like civil society organizations are willing and wanting to work, but they fortunately or unfortunately have to work with established organizations to do that. So then how do we work with that dynamics is the question. And right now in Nepal, I think the Kastamandap Reconstruction Committee has been completely dissolved, or is in the process of being dissolved, and the government has taken over. Now that the project is almost built. So it's an interesting dynamic that I hope to study more
You
and
know,
talk to more.
one thing I think what is very important for us within the heritage field is role recognition, in the sense like really understanding what's the role of each organization and to what extent we can work with them. In the sense like, or what would be the best aspect of the work that this organization can do for us. That I think is very important and distinguishing.
So I was just wondering, does that happen in Nepal in terms of volunteer orientation? What do the volunteers, state, government, what do they provide apart from resources? Because we've seen from your presentation that the community within Nepal itself is actually very oriented towards rebuilding. They have their artisans and all. What do the others actually provide?
So this is a very, very interesting question. And this is something that I'm really interested in researching more on, and have also worked on a paper on in MIT on this particular question of
Oh, nice.
basically disaster diplomacy and the role of different multilateral and bilateral organizations in
Yes.
mobilizing voluntary groups in Nepal. From what I understand, and again, it's a lot of research that I'll have to go back and do. But from what I understand on that part is that the civil society movement actually was spearheaded by the Bhuti Sanstans, which are generational community landed trusts. So by their nature of their being, they are voluntary organizations where a member of each family, of a Newar family, is a part of that organization, and all of them pay a certain amount for being a part of the trust, and are also volunteering their time for, say, festivals like the Indra Jatra or the upkeep of community property. And this is something that's a tradition. This has been happening for many generations now. So this is already, to a point, it is a important group. And now in recent years, from the 1960s or something, I think it's been nationalized, and so has been losing its it's been doing a lot of the work, but has been losing a lot of its funding. And what happened right after the disaster was actually that there were several multilateral and bilateral organizations that swooped in at that point for providing aid, and 5 years down the line are still there. So like if you go to Kathmandu Darbar Square, there's one building that's being built by JICA, like the Japan organization. There's one very prominent building being built by China. There's one very prominent building being built by USAID. And Kasta Mandap is where also I think an international organization was interested in rebuilding. The community at this point revolted. And they said that, no, we want to build it our way. So that is a very interesting point as to how they got mobilized. Why particularly only for Kasta Mandap? Where are the other points where this is happening? Was there any involvement of political organizations in any of this?
But we have to move on, and thanks, Ipshita, for your time and presenting all these wonderful studies, which not only touches the disaster or the cultural heritage, but also discusses about, also throw light on how we take our, what is the role of Indian professionals from the heritage fields in offering to other countries like our neighboring countries, and how do the relationship of government to government is one thing, but the relationship of us professionals where culture is aligned and very much similar. So what is our role? And thanks for sharing the work from Nepal to India to America, and thanks for all the wonderful presentation and insights. Thank you everyone for giving us time and coming out together and being a part of this healthy discussion, which will surely further lead to many projects. Thanks everyone.
Thank you, Ipshita.